Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. It's Ukraine War News Update, part 2 thereof, for the 9th of August 2023. And we're going to go straight to the frontline update, the segment that is the smaller, more concise version of my more in-depth frontline update that will come out later today, hopefully, depending on what I'm doing. Just to remind people, I'm on holiday, sitting in a hotel room, neglecting being on the beach with my family, so I will rush through this. Anyway, you can see a massive move by the Russians in this Kupiansk area. That is, just to let you know, in this very northeastern sector of the front line, all the way along here, this kind of arc from the Kupiansk area, or more like the Liman Pershi area. Kupiansk is down here, Liman Pershi is up there, and this arc all the way down here, where Syrian maps are saying the Ukrainian Russians have made substantial gains there. Situation on northeastern front during the last hours, the Russian army managed to capture new positions south of Pershio-Travnevi and Vilshana, and east of Orlyanska and Yahidna towns. Now, I was listening to Andrew Perpetua's live stream. Well, not live, I was listening to it this morning. And he was saying that actually the high ground around here is occupied by the Ukrainians, and the Russians generally, when they do things like this, don't hold on to the area for more than a few hours. So he was implying that actually this wasn't robust control of this area, and they are being hit by artillery and tank fire. So there's the fire, I don't know if it's direct or indirect, probably direct if the tanks are sitting on top of the higher ground and are able to hammer these positions. So although that looks quite impressive on a map, he was not too impressed and thought that it wouldn't be a case of the Russians holding on to this ground very easily. He said that they lacked supply up here, the logistics was poor, and so not too much to worry about. But then the flip side is, oh look, this is significant territory they've taken. This is something to think about for the Ukrainians. Do they have enough forces in the area to defend against this? What is going on here? Are they trying to put a spanner in the works for Ukrainian counter offensive maneuvers elsewhere? Is this about forcing the Ukrainians to bring troops and fixing them up here that would otherwise be used in more important places, so on and so forth? So all of these same kind of calculations are to be made here, or can the Ukrainians rebuff these attacks with what they've got in the area? And if they can, obviously, then it's potentially the Russians throwing themselves into areas and attriting their own forces for no great gain. We'll see. I mean, they tried to do that down here near Karmazianivka, and by all accounts, that has stalled. There's nothing happening there as far as the Russians making any further advances. So I don't really know. We have as well, although there looks like Ukrainian. These are Russian gains. That's the wrong color, actually. So that should be red. Yeah. So Novosibirsk has been taken by the Russians. They have pushed the Ukrainians out there. As far as I understand it, the Ukrainians were had just rotated. So this was a bit of a green unit that was there. And I think, I'm used to fighting. That's a good time to counterattack. The Russians do that quite often, which is they wait for rotations and then hit the Ukrainians, and often have some success. However, this morning there is footage coming out from the Russians of them hitting Novosibirsk with incendiary munitions, and our reports here says that would refute the claim that the Russian Ministry of Defense have made that the settlement of Novosibirsk is fully under their control. Apparently, it's still being fought over. I don't know. I don't know the provenance of this footage and whether that is definitely time stamped to this morning. But if the Russians aren't pushed out of if the Ukrainians aren't pushed out of Novosibirsk, they will be pretty soon, I'm pretty sure. So my guess, and from what other sources are saying, like Konstantin, that yes, the Ukrainians have been pushed out of Novosibirsk. So that will be a shame for them, because they've been fighting over that for an awful long time. That said, it's not like it's got massive strategic importance. It is on slightly higher ground than Kuzmivka, which does give you that advantage. But yeah, back there it's fairly flat. I don't know what the Ukrainians will do with that, whether this is a major concern to them. Not much information going on in the sort of Crimea area and the Bilahorivka area, and there's some fighting in the north. I think Russians lost quite a few in a failed attack at Bakivka yesterday, and there are gains supposedly. Well, no, those are the gains that I showed you yesterday for uh, Syriac maps for the area around Klishchiivka. I was saying they're just simply wrong about Klishchiivka. Other people, pro-Russian voices on my thread are saying, well, look, even Deep State Map has part of Klishchiivka under Russian control. As far as I can work out from all the sources, Russians do not have control of Klishchiivka. They are out of Klishchiivka. The problem is the Ukrainians don't have control of it, and apparently it's a relatively small place. It's just like two roads, and the Russians are hammering it with artillery. So whenever the Ukrainians move there, they just get hammered by artillery. So it's a massive grey zone, really, and the Ukrainians don't have robust control over it because of Russian artillery. Russians are pretty much pushed back to the railway line, but it's fairly well dug in, so they can either attack through Avdiivka, get to the railway line, and go up to go along the railway line to clear out the Russians that may still be slightly to the west of the railway line, or they can come down. But it's fairly difficult, and they've been finding it difficult to make large gains on top of what they have made over the last couple of weeks. So there seems to be difficulty for the Ukrainians here in continuing that momentum, I guess, until that artillery is taken out. Right, let's go to my sources. So going back to Luhansk front, the Ukrainians making gains in Kovalivka. So that's in the Karmazianivka sort of area that I was telling you about, where the Russians seem to have stalled, and the Ukrainians are continuing to push the Russians back there. And then I've just told you about Bakhmut. We're now going to go down to Urizhny, which is in the southern Donetsk front line near the Zaporizhia border, where we have Staromyrsky and Urizhny, and the Ukrainians are still trying hard to take Urizhny. Deep State Map has confirmed the frontline changes north of Urizhny. According to their map, the northern half of the village is now a grey zone. So here we have, yeah, that northern half is a grey zone just up there. That's Urizhny. This is Staromyrsky. So that is a claim from there. And then a more general one here from the Ukrainian spokespeople. So now there are battles for breaking through the first line of defense of the invaders in the south. According to him, the Ukrainian fighters have moved forward in the Berdyansk direction. So this is in the Velika Novosilka area, as well as in the Robotina area in Melitopol. So this is where there were some claims yesterday that the Russians had pushed the Ukrainians back there, but the official Ukrainian line is that they are pushing the Russians back. The Russians actively use elite reserves from the second line of defense, paratroopers, Marines, and special forces. The Ukrainian offensive is slowed down by large numbers of minefields as well as lack of aviation. So that's what we already know. But the first part is very interesting, that if they are using, and I talked about this yesterday, they're using their paratroopers, Marines, and special forces to defend the trenches of the front line as kind of basically their primary defense. That means that they have nothing in the locker. That is, if that's true, that is a really important, possibly the most important thing to hear about today in the whole frontline update. If they are truly using these forces to man the trench lines, then the Russians are in serious trouble. It's whether that is indeed true. Okay, Alexander Pershin, an infantryman, said that the fields east of Robotina, the ability of cluster munitions to wipe out tree cover was invaluable. So this is sad for the environment. The environment is getting absolutely trashed. Trees are getting absolutely decimated. And the talk is that cluster munitions are really invaluable for decimating the trees. Like, this is a good thing militarily speaking, because it just takes out all the cover. During a recent assault on a Russian position, he said there was no tree left above waist height. So cluster munitions are apparently making a really positive impact for the military. Also, 60 men in the Ukrainian assault, he said 45 have been injured or killed. So uh, that is, yeah, it is tough for the Ukrainians uh, um, attacking in that area. There will be massive losses for the Ukrainians, but there also are large losses for the Russians, as we saw in the daily update, General Staff daily update this morning. Um, yeah. So now we're going to go on to the Dnipro River. Let's go to the map here just to give you a sense of where we're talking about. So Robotna, different claims. Russians making some gains, Ukrainians making some gains. Both sides claiming that it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians. And then we have all this stuff that's going on in Dnipro River. We have claims of increased control in the grey zone. So the Ukrainians now control a whole bunch of this area. Don't look at the red line here, the Andrew Perpetua blue line of the Russian defense here. And you have this large grey zone right across to the other side of the river. Obviously, the other side of the river is firmly in the control of the Ukrainians. And then all of this middle part is grey zone. But actually, Andrew Perpetua has lots of this area now blue controlled. Um, a lot more is they've been gradually just increasing their control all the way along here and along parts of these islands. And then the claim is that they are attacking sort of south of the Conquer River, this smaller river there, towards Oleshki. They've perhaps got a bridgehead at Holopristan. It's not a lot of news has come out about that in the last 24 hours, but that was sort of came out 48 hours ago. And there's all this talk about what's going on in Kozachi Lahiri, different claims about the number of troops that the Ukrainians have managed to get across the river there. So Ukrainian fighters landed on the left bank of the Dnipro, causing panic among the occupiers. Near the village of Kozachi Tabori was the landing of our fighters together with special forces of the GUR, who expelled the Russians 1322 battalions from their positions. This made it possible to create a stronghold on the left bank. Our fighters bypassed the Kozachi Tabori from the south and continued their offensive in the direction of Chelberda village. It's different sort of Kozachi Lahiri Tabori. Further movement creates conditions for encircling the units located there. I was talking to you about a whole group who were captured or killed. So this is Major Tomov. He had a group who was ambushed, a Russian group who was ambushed. Survivors were all made POWs. A total of 25 soldiers were killed or captured. And the Ukrainians captured weapons, radio stations, phones, ammo, and other valuable information during the attack. So that is significant. Now, the claim here then is that Kozachi Lahiri has been kind of either liberated or basically they've ended up going past there towards a village of Chelberda to the south. So you can see that's quite some distance. Andrew Perpetua is talking about pinpointing where there's both shelling from satellite data and also FIRMS data. FIRMS data is heat signatures coming from, well, basically the is it NASA satellites pick up heat signatures from all around the world to try and identify forest fires and things. That was what it was originally used for, but it's actually been used to identify areas of intense heat representing fires and whatnot along the battlefront. And there's FIRMS data coming from around here to suggest that there is indeed activity there that is taking place. The claims are that the Ukrainians have managed to get past Kozachi Lahiri and are working towards Chelberda. There are claims that they've taken that village of Kozachi Lahiri and other claims, against that. Here, Kozachi Lahiri, or Cossack Camp in English, where about 80 Ukrainians assaulted successfully the Russian unit, which had just been rotated there. Remember what it's telling you about what happened in Novosibirsk? Well, this is in reverse. So the Ukrainians hitting the Russians where they had rotated. And apparently, I think they would just sort of mobilize troops there, not very well trained, etc., and equipped, and therefore easy pickings, arguably, for the Ukrainians. Per the reports, Ukrainians occupy the west side firmly. There are now reports that Ukrainians are moving more inland, presumably to encircle the Russians. As a reminder, southwest, the Ukrainians already have a foothold near Oleshki at the Antonivsky Bridge. Too early to have a precise idea of the intentions in that area. I suppose if you're sort of pro-Ukrainian, you'll be thinking, right, this is a place to start then getting. what you would want to do is get as much stuff across the river as you can as quickly as possible. I don't know, I'm sure they've been training for this. I don't know where the best places to do that would be. As Constantine said yesterday on the live stream with Andrew Perpetua, you just do it where you have the least amount of artillery bombardment. So, wherever that is, you put some pontoon bridges or whatever you can to get across. I don't know how big the river is now with the breaking of the dam, but you try and get as much stuff across that as quickly as possible and then start expanding your bridgehead. So then when you've got an expanded bridgehead, you can more safely get stuff across and clearing out artillery as well to give you the ability to do that kind of continually. And then once you've done that, this becomes a real concern for the Russians because you can then talk about another front being opened. And this is a front that is not well defended because they've moved all their best troops out. Again, this goes back to why it's so important to note that you've got elite troops fighting in the trenches around Robotna. Why is that important? Because it means that those elite troops aren't anywhere else and they don't have any other troops anywhere else because you put them in the trenches before you put your elite troops in the trenches. They're your crack troops that you're supposed to use to do particular maneuvers here and there, not to just stuff into trenches to do general defensive work. And it means that if you're attacking across the river, what do the Russians have to bring to bear to defend this bridgehead against Ukrainian continued momentum? Well, they've got nothing. And if they've got nothing but sort of poorly equipped and trained mobilized soldiers here, then this could be a serious problem. And you have perhaps got a free pass to army ants. Now, there are lots of defensive entrenchments built here, and there are lots of minefields. However, if you don't have the people to cover those minefields in the trenches, then it's kind of moot point. And if the Ukrainians can move down these roads, demine these roads relatively easily, and move down the roads, then this could be really significant for the Ukrainians. So there it is. That's what I have to say about that. Just other claims about there are sporadic reports that Ukrainians have moved past the southern part of Kozachi Lahiri and are beginning to envelop Chelberda with the potential of encirclement of the Russians defending the village. Again, you're wondering whether this is too positive. Randy Mott says this occurs near the old bridge site where the Russians have been unable to. So he's talking about Tendar saying Ukrainian forces have launched a surprise attack near Kozachi Lahiri, south of the Dnipro River. OPSEC prevented reporting of it for good reason. So Randy Mott says this occurs near the old bridge site where the Russians have been unable to dislodge a couple of hundred Ukrainian soldiers for weeks. Russian dilemma: do they move forces to crush this or keep their units that are engaged further east and north? The best tactics force the enemy to make difficult choices, all of which have bad consequences. So this is the difference between a problem and a dilemma that's often talked about in war. If you have a problem, then you have a solution. If you have a dilemma, you don't have a solution. You've got two bad outcomes. It's like the least worst of the two bad outcomes is what you choose. So this is a dilemma, not a problem for the Russians, and that is much better for the Ukrainians. And Trentelenko talks about this in a really interesting logistics thread. He says the move of the Russian VDV units from Kherson to Zaporizhia, so the airborne units, elite units, while the Ukrainians have a light infantry bridgehead, is an utterly dangerous move that is merited only by imminent collapse on the Zaporizhia front, caused by a Russian logistical lack of mines. And this is on the back of talking about logistically how much of a problem the Russians are in. So, and I'll just quickly go through this with you. Now we know where Russians are now shipping its fuel and ammo now that the Crimean ground lines of communication have been interdicted. A Russian logistical desperation thread. The Russians are now dependent on occupied Ukrainian civilian ISO container export facilities at Berdyansk to bring in supplies to their army. And he refers to that image to give you a sense of there's Berdyansk, and they are using civilian container export logistics. And also Mariupol have ISO container cranes for foreign export that can take container ship traffic from Novorossiysk for military supplies. Russian or captured Ukrainian semi-tractor trailer rigs could move ISO containers full of supplies to 85 to 100 kilometers back from MLRS reload points. but it's more likely Kamaz or Ural trucks are loading from dispersed container yards outside the port facilities proper. The pressing Russian forces logistics issue is moving fuel for its vehicles. Fuel is heavy and outmasses ammo for mechanized units. Any non-command vehicle in the Russian army lacks auxiliary power units that and have to run their engines on recharged batteries. Since the radios, night vision, and most of the firepower in the Russian army is in its vehicles, no fuel by rail is disastrous. Russian forces won't have fuel to move its fuel to the front lines by truck without rails, by most estimates. We have seen indications in the Ukrainian strikes that they are watching the rail and road bridges as well as the major ports. But is Ukraine paying enough attention to the Russian barge traffic coming into Berdyansk and Mariupol? Rostov-on-Don is too far away to be a good truck supply point into Mariupol, Ukraine. Taganrog is. It is, in addition to being the primary railway marshalling yard supporting Russian operation into Ukraine, the primary export point for Russia's river traffic to the sea. You can move a lot of grain from the interior of Russia with a barge. Ukraine figure the same applies with grain barges for them up the Danube in November 2022. But the Black Sea grain deal put it on the very back burner. My question is, has Russia been using barge traffic out of Rostov-on-Don to move large quantities of fuel and supplies into southern Ukraine to avoid the partisan port, road, and rail watchers? There are plenty of small coastal towns in the Sea of Azov a shallow draft Russian fuel barge can put into. It wouldn't be the first time this was missed. The biggest intelligence failure of the 1944 Normandy transportation plan was not including river barge traffic as a target for Allied air power. So then, he goes on to say that basically they're your Russian logistics is in a whole heap of problem. One of their only solutions might be using sort of shallow hold barges to do a lot of transportation into those ports to then get them out by truck to the southern Zaporizhia front line. And thank you for Trent Telenko to that. Yeah, and then talks about how so if we go to the part where that I thought was one of the most revealing was move of the Russian VDV units from Kherson to Zaporizhia is showing a huge problem. Whatever the reason for the VDV 7th Brigade move, it looks more and more like military desperation move, given the latest information on Ukrainian moves across the Dnipro. Real problem for them. Anyway, indeed, I accidentally went into a completely different thread there. I'm sure some of you noticed. Actually, let's go back to what Trent Telenko says in this original thread, that the Russians are now dependent on occupied Ukrainian civilian container export facilities. And that's a thread I went into. He said, we should be looking for a similar Russian surface-to-air missile battery reinforcement for the port of Mariupol to defend against Ukrainian hits on that the export sort of terminals there. Russian armed forces truck convoys from both ports are the only real option for the next month or so to maintain their current front lines in Zaporizhia. The two key short-term logistical needs for the Russian armed forces in Zaporizhia are fuel for Russian vehicles and tons of new mines for the second and third Surovikin lines. The Ukrainians have rotated the 10th Corps into the Zaporizhia front. This means fresh Western combat vehicles whose maintenance is in top shape to take advantage of any breakthrough, and the lack of Russian mines will make that possible. The addition of a possible Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnipro through the first line of trenches opens up an additional avenue of maneuver for fresh Ukrainian reserve brigades, also with fresh Western war gear. Whatever the reason for the VDV 7th Brigade move, it looks a little more like military desperation, as I mentioned. So that's what's going on the front line, and you could see the Russian logistic issues being a real major component in kind of what happens next. Okay, very quickly onto military aid. An unnamed country has bought a batch of Leopard 1 tanks to hand them over to Ukraine in the near future. They were bought from OAP Land Systems in Belgium, which has about 50 Leopard 1 tanks. Well, it turns out that's Rheinmetall who's purchased 50 Leopard 1 tanks. So the unnamed purchaser soon came out. German arms manufacturer was identified as the buyer. And the first two Leopard 1 tanks of the Belgian entrepreneur Frederick Volusse went for modernization. In the future, they will be transferred to Ukraine, according to this standard. Tank loading took place at the facility of the OIP Land Systems Company in the city of Tournai. It is reported that there are 50 tanks in the warehouse and they were purchased by, well, we know Rheinmetall. The tanks will first stop in Germany and Italy, where they will be overhauled and equipped with modern weapons systems. After that, they will go to the battlefield. So that's really good news. Germany has 175 Leopard 1A5s being rebuilt and fixed for Ukraine. Denmark has more, and now someone has purchased 50 more. Well, we know that's Rheinmetall. Italy and the Swiss have more that may be sent, 100 to 150. The Swiss won't let any of them go, that's for sure. That leaves the Greeks and the Turks with the last stockpiles of 1A5s. This is about 10-ish battalions of tanks. Yes, it will take months to send them all, but it's a solution for needed tanks in good numbers. Absolutely. If they're fighting against the older T family tanks, and they have upgraded weapon systems, fire control systems, thermal optics, and whatnot, then these will have a competitive advantage over those other tanks. And it depends how you use them. It's not going to be tank on tank battles anyway. That's a highly unlikely use of these tanks. Anyway, moving on. That's just really good news. Unofficial sources report the use of Israeli-made multiple launch rocket system Lynx in Zaporizhia. There's been no reported transfer of those systems. Lynx is a versatile system that allows fire of from 122 mil to 370 mil rockets. Allegedly, Ukrainians use it to destroy the Russian artillery, where they have made progress, including today. 6 Lynx are in service with Ukraine, reportedly. Wow, that'd be pretty significant if that is the case. Ukraine recently received at least 50 Scalp cruise missiles from France. That's what we thought anyway. It would be about 50, and that is indeed what is being announced here. Now, what was interesting about this, according to the Bild, the Ukrainian Air Force converted about 12 Soviet Su-24s to launch Scalp and Storm Shadow. So that, and they are possibly getting Taurus now. That is more at the beginning. I think it was only a couple of Su-24s that could fire them, and now there are supposedly 12. So that is fairly significant. Moving on, we have Polish delivered KTO Rozomak armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles in service of the Ukrainian military near the front line somewhere in Ukraine. In April 2023, it's announced that Kiev ordered approximately 200 such vehicles from Warsaw. The order was supposed to be financed from US and EU funds. So that is really useful. 200 of those vehicles suddenly on the front lines or near the front lines, very useful. The Canadian-Ukrainian Foundation donated 100 MOVES SLC life support systems to Ukraine. This is stated in the press release of the fund. Portable life support systems will help monitor the vital signs of patients, provide mechanical ventilation, and prevent complications during transport to hospitals. Super useful, improves the wounded in action to killed in action ratios, and that is already to the advantage of the Ukrainians. And something like this, again, as I always say, when the Ukrainians receive something like this, what are the Russians receiving? When they get this, are the Russians not getting that? In which case, this is again just an asymmetrical situation in favor of the Ukrainians. Black Hornet nano-military micro drone in the arms of the Ukrainian fighters in the Kraken special unit. Now, we know that there were a whole bunch of these Norwegian drones. The US provided a bunch. I think Norway might have provided a bunch as well. Already being used. These are ones you generally use in urban scenarios. They're really small, so they kind of fly around the corner in buildings and whatnot, just so you know who is where and what. These would be probably super useful in places like Klishchivka and clearing out sort of buildings where the Russians have been. Rather than sending yourself around a corner to be shot at by a waiting Russian, just send a little drone ahead to give you eyes instead of sending a human, and then you can follow on afterwards. USA plans on announcing another $200 million military aid package for Ukraine. The new military package will include mine clearing equipment, good, tow, and those are the wired optical launchers or anti-tank missiles that get sent out from the top of, well, any number of things, really. You can have them on top of Bradleys here, Humvee, although I don't know if that is that. And 84 anti-tank weapons, more air defense missiles and ammunitions ammunition for HIMARS. Really good stuff there. Tim White says, amid the controversy about Elon Musk blocking Ukraine's use of Starlink satellites near Crimea or the front line, new gear may be arriving from Sweden. This report by Dagens Nyheter details how SatCube is sending 100 terminals to Kyiv. There's obviously been a bit of scrabbling around to see if there can be any alternative to Starlink from Elon Musk, because he has that power and controls the outcomes so often in terms of the usage of those. Although there have been a whole bunch of Starlink terminals that have been bought that have been they've had the geofencing removed from them, so they can't be locked into being used in only certain places by Musk or by Starlink or whatever. The problem for any alternative is that Starlink just has such good satellite coverage. I mean, they have 53% of the satellites operating in low Earth orbit. Just to try and you know outcompete Starlink is virtually impossible now, isn't it? Okay, and on to the next point. So, Pentagon announces Biden has cleared F-16 training for Ukrainian pilots. I didn't realize that they're still waiting for that. But Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh confirmed on yesterday that President Biden has given the green light to allow this and support the training of Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets. That word is important, to allow and support. In other words, they're going to be involved in the training as well. Denmark and Netherlands are taking the lead on training, Singh said, adding that she doesn't have any further updates at this time when it comes to specific pilots being trained. We already know that the Ukrainians have chosen the first echelon of pilots to receive that training. They are, I think, the ones with the best English, because it's really important they understand both the systems and the instruction. Going on to geopolitical stuff, Italy suspends golden visas for Russians, good, and Belarusians, good. Italy has suspended the investor visa program for Russian and Belarusian citizens, the country's business ministry announced on its website. The Italian magazine Alteconomia reported on August the 8th that the Italian government made the decision in mid-July, more than a year after the European Commission recommended this measure after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As possibly, as someone said, I don't think it will hurt the Russians as much as it will hurt the Italians. So that might be why we've seen a lack of movement there until now. Russia's lack of ships and Western grain traders' shrinking appetite for business with Moscow are adding to rising costs of moving Russian wheat at a time when the war in Ukraine has spilled perilously close to vital Black Sea supply routes. This is pretty important. This is Reuters, and shows that the Russians, at a time when the grain deal has fallen through, are going to be struggling with their own export of wheat. I mean, Russia is a huge exporter of wheat anyway. I mean, they're a huge producer of wheat. It's a massive country. Here, the summary is Russian turning to shadow fleet to move its grain. So we already kind of knew that. Major global grain traders reduce activity in Russia. Russia is aiming to export volumes of wheat near record highs, but Russian operated fleet of grain ships is well below the needs. There will be growing pains as they are trying to fill the gaps that are left by the Ukrainian wheat exports that have been hit by Russia themselves. And you'll have issues with insurance. The ports in the Black Sea, the Russian ports in the Black Sea, are now war zones, as according to Ukraine, and they've hit that tanker, the sea tanker, they've hit the Russian naval vessel, and that will possibly invalidate those ports from being used, at least with normal insurance on those ships, and that adds to Russia's woes there. It depends whether there can be, with the EU and the US and UK and whatnot, can try and fix these loopholes with regard to the ghost tankers and these shadow fleets that are kind of Russian but not Russian, that are doing all the movement and allowing them to get around the sanctions. Investigations into who was behind the Electoral Commission attack are continuing, but the Times has been told that they have picked up evidence of Russian activity during the 10-month inquiry. Right. This is the UK. The Electoral Commission, who kind of organises our elections, have had a 10-month investigation and found that pretty much hostile actors behind meddling appear to be Russia, although they haven't linked it to the Kremlin yet. But you know, if Russians are behind cyber attacks on Britain's electoral register, then it would be rather weird if that wasn't the Kremlin behind that, just some random Russian actors. Uh, Yes, so if we just dip into this, the Electoral Commission revealed it had been the target of a complex cyber attack, but insisted there was little risk of those being behind the attack being able to influence the outcome of any vote. The Commission disclosed on Tuesday that hackers had managed to gain access to copies of the electoral register from August 2021, but it only discovered the security breach over a year later in October 2022. The Commission called in cybersecurity chiefs from GCHQ, so that's our kind of national intelligence and security sort of based in Cheltenham, to investigate and secure its systems, but the identity of what it described as hostile actors has yet to be identified. But it says that so later on, it says that they are pretty certain there is Russia behind it. Yeah, talking about the troll farm, that's Prigozhin's troll farm in St. Petersburg. Where is it? I have read it. Bear with me 2 ticks. The very next paragraph. Investigations into who was behind the attack are continuing, but the Times has been told that they have picked up evidence of Russian activity during a 10-month inquiry, although there is no evidence of, at this stage, of links to the Kremlin. So David Ormand, a former director of GCHQ, said he suspects the Russians are behind the attack because of their recent interference with democratic elections in the UK, US, France, and Germany. So I've talked to you about this before. Some people like to deny it, and they confuse collusion, the whole kind of Trump collusion Mueller report, with meddling. These are not the same thing, right? This is not saying US has gone to Russia and said, "Oh, let's do a deal with dodgy sort of Democrat, whatever." This is good old interference with the democratic process, using social media, using influencing, using misinformation, disinformation, all this kind of stuff, and cyber attacks. Now, as GCHQ here, or the ex-leader says, we know that Russia have interfered in UK elections, like Brexit election, 2 US elections, French and German elections. Like this, we already know this. The social media companies have admitted this. So Facebook and Twitter, have admitted this happened, right? So we know it's happened. As I said before, we need to make damn sure this can't happen again. And lo and behold, it has happened. Like we've had a cyber attack on UK Electoral Commission. We need to just all allied nations here need to make sure Russia cannot do this, and increasingly China cannot do this going forward. Anyway, I've spoken too long. Thanks so much. Please like, subscribe, and share. To the pit. Speak to you later.